Hi guys, my name's Austin. I'm going to be talking to you guys a little bit about action potentials. First, I'd like to go over what an action potential is. An action potential is an electrical impulse that is sent from a neuron or a cell body down through the axon and into either the next neuron or ultimately into the targeted tissue site. So these action potentials are a means of communication from cell to cell into that, again, targeted tissue. These action potentials are initiated right here. We can see this arrow on the axon hillock. That is the uh, point from where the neural soma ends and the axon begins. An action potential only occurs when the neuron hits a membrane potential of a certain threshold. That threshold is called the threshold value. We'll talk a lot more about that in the next slide. I just wanted to briefly touch on that right now. Right here, you can see an action potential timeline. It's an XY graph. The time being down here, this is a total of about 5 milliseconds, so it's very, very quick. And over here is the measurement of energy. And this is a positive 40 and again, negative 90 millivolts. They're measured in millivolts. So if you remember from, I believe it was module 5, we talked about resting membrane potential and what it was. We're going to look back on that a lot this talk. So that resting membrane potential is somewhere around negative 70 millivolts for the average cell. That dotted line right above that indicates the threshold value that we had talked about, and that's somewhere around negative 50 to negative 55 millivolts. This right here is called the peak value, and this dip below that resting membrane potential is called the hyperpolarization. So from the beginning, your cell membrane is sitting right here, that resting membrane potential, negative 70 millivolts. You have an input or a stimulus from another area, i.e. a graded potential, which comes and begins to depolarize this cell. Boom, boom. And eventually it will get a depolarization or a stimulus that is large enough to hit that threshold. Once you hit that threshold, it causes a few different things. First, it's going to cause a rapid influx of sodium into the cells. It does that by activating all of the voltage-gated sodium channels. And when those are open, they all open at the same time, and a ton of sodium just rapidly goes into the cell. That's why you have this rapid depolarization. All of these positively charged sodiums are going into the cell and depolarizing this membrane into the positive levels. That peak value that I mentioned, it comes right around that positive 30 to positive 40 millivolts. At that point, when you hit that peak value, all of the sodium ion channels close and the voltage gated potassium channels open up. And now you have a rapid efflux of potassium ions out of the cell. That causes an electrical charge of the intracellular membrane to fall. And as these potassium ions move out, the axon or that cell membrane begins to repolarize back to that normal negative 70 millivolts for that resting membrane potential. That's what all of this is. This is the repolarization where all of these positively charged potassiums are exiting the cell, and we're equalizing this back down to the resting membrane potential. Again, I mentioned that hyperpolarization. That's what we have right here. From this rapid drop, it overshoots and ends up going down to about negative 80, negative 90 millivolts until it equals back up to this negative 70. These two terms here, we'll talk about those in another slide, but for now, the absolute refractory period is this small time frame right here where no matter what, these sodium channels are not opening back up. They are closed for good. After you leave this absolute refractory period and go into the relative refractory period, now we're saying that it takes a very large stimulus to reopen those. you're probably not going to get another action potential in this phase here, but in this phase it is possible because you are in that relative refractory period. This phase, it's not possible. This phase is possible, just not likely. Again, back to this resting membrane potential. Quickly go over this for you guys. The resting membrane potential sits at approximately -70 millivolts, and that's going to be like right in this area right here where you have this intracellular, right along that cellular membrane on the inside. The reason that this intracellular cellular membrane has a mildly negative charge comes from three reasons. First off being there's a group of larger molecules that are negatively charged inside the cell that are, for lack of better terms, stuck inside there and can't be out. So that causes just a mild negative membrane potential. And then there are these leak channels that you see here, and there is a lot more of the potassium leak channels than there are sodium leak channels. So a lot more positively charged ions are leaving than are coming in. So therefore it causes a negative charge inside this cell. Lastly are these sodium potassium pumps listed right here. That's the primary reason for this negative resting membrane potential. And in one cycle of the sodium potassium pump, you are going to see 3 sodiums leaving the cell and 2 potassiums coming into the cell. So you're taking more positively charged ones out than you are putting positively charged ones back in. Therefore, you end up with a net negative charge. Voltage gated channels and mechanical gated channels. We're talking about channels similar to this one here and this one here, except they're just gated by something. The voltage gated channels, you're going to see those with the action potentials that we're talking about now, and the mechanical gated channels you'll see with the graded potentials. This is an image here of an example of a voltage gated sodium channel, and this is when it's open. And it would be in a situation of the depolarization. We're having a rapid influx of sodium. All of the sodium is able to go into the cell until you hit that peak value, and now it closes. And now you're in this. This is an example of the refractory period where it's not going to reopen. It's closed, it's not going to reopen. Here's another picture of a neuron here, and we're going to talk about the action potential travel. Action potentials travel down through the axon via a term called propagation. And there are 2 means of propagation that we're going to go over here today. The first one is what you would see with this neuron here, and it's called saltatory conduction. It happens on axons that have myelin sheaths. That are those myelin sheaths are these colored oval, I guess, type things. And this action potential begins here at this axon hillock, sends the sodium influx down to this first darker circle here, which is the node of Ranvier. And at that point, once it hits this node, you see this conduction just leaping. It jumps from node to node to node. So this means of travel is much quicker than the alternative. The alternative happens when there are none of these myelin sheets, and you just have this axon right in here. And that's where you get this continuous conduction. The action potential begins here at this axon hillock and just continuously flows down through this axon. Okay, this image here is a very similar picture to the one that we saw before of the timeline of the action potential, except I put in some failed initiations on this graph here. So these are stimulus that have come down into this neuron here near this axon hillock, and is trying to set off an action potential. These first two that are listed here are failed initiations where they've not reached that threshold. You have here maybe -60, -65, -60, and you're just not quite reaching that threshold to activate that action potential. These stimuluses are graded potentials. Graded potentials are what initiates an action potential. So on these failed initiations, these are just smaller graded potentials that have not been able to become a action potential just yet. Okay, to quickly summarize and review what we talked about, walk through an entire action potential from start to finish. So to start, you have these graded potentials that come down and are beginning that sodium influx into the cell and making small depolarizations. That happens until you reach that threshold, which is again usually around that -50 to -55 millivolts. Once you have a large enough graded potential that reaches that, now you've activated an action potential. Once that action potential is initiated, all of those voltage gated sodium channels open and you have a rapid influx of sodium into the cell until you hit that peak +30, +40 millivolts peak value range. At which point the sodium channels close and the potassium voltage gated channels open and you have a rapid efflux of potassium out of the cell. You have a brief drop in that cell membrane potential where it goes down into the -80, -90 millivolt range, and then you will stabilize back into the -70 millivolts range. Throughout the depolarization and repolarization, you have two refractory periods that you need to remember. The first one is the absolute refractory period. That's when those sodium channels are either open or have just closed. So for a few milliseconds after they've just closed, there is no opening them back up. They have an absolute refractory period that they have to more or less reset before they can reopen. The important thing to remember here about that is that's how you ensure that this action potential is going to continue traveling down the axon instead of traveling back up. So if this absolute refractory period wasn't here, and these sodium ions may enter the channels that are behind them that they just came out of and end up sending this impulse back up into this neuron. But because of that absolute refractory period, we ensure that that doesn't happen. And then lastly, the continuous and saltatory conductions, or the means of propagation, the means of carrying that action potential down through the axon into this axon terminal and into that synaptic cleft to take it to its targeted site. Saltatory conduction comes with these myelinated sheath axons, and the continuous conduction comes with the unmyelinated sheath ones. That is all I have today, guys. I appreciate it. Thank you for your time. I hope that I did a good job of explaining that to you and went thorough enough for you guys. Good luck with everything. Thank you.